Today, you're going to learn exactly what React.js is, and we're going to cover some core concepts of React.js like components, JSX, interactivity, whether you can use React full stack, how React is just a library, the community around React, job outlook, and all of those things regarding React.js. This video is going to be the first video of a full course on React.js. So if you're just getting into React.js, or maybe you went away from React.js and you want to get back into it, this video is going to be good for you. So what is React? Well, React is just a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And before we go further, this is a web page that I created just to help me present this video. Is not somewhere you can actually go and see, but if you're interested, definitely leave a comment below and I can give you the code to this website if you're interested. But React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces both on web and mobile. The library is just some pre-written code that provides somewhat of helper functions and other tools to build whatever you're looking to build. So React, it uses JavaScript to help users build user interfaces, which a user interface is what the user actually sees. So what we're seeing here on this page, we're seeing 3 columns of 3 different rows in this grid layout with these cards that flip around and the user can interact with these cards. I'm using React to build this user interface, what the user actually sees and interacts with. React is a JavaScript library, so it uses JavaScript, and you also use JavaScript within React, where you can build what the user sees on a web page or even on mobile using React Native. And you do that through using some of the pre-written code and structures that come from this React.js library. Now, before diving into React, what should you know? Well, React, it fundamentally builds on the web or native. So if you want to build web apps, it's going to be really important for you to understand fundamentals when it comes to HTML, CSS, as well as JavaScript. Now, if you're building natively, so you're building mobile applications, then in those cases, there's a little bit less CSS that you'll need to know, although depending on what mobile route you go, you can use stuff that kind of looks like CSS. But regardless, when using React, understanding HTML, JavaScript, and how to style applications is going to be important. Now, you don't need to necessarily know everything about how HTML works and CSS and JavaScript. I've been working in React for several years and I still don't know everything when it comes to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, at least not off the top of my head. But you should know the fundamental concepts of how those technologies work. I think you should be able to build at least kind of basic websites using just JavaScript, HTML, CSS. You should understand how the DOM works and how to manipulate the DOM. All that stuff really does come in handy when using React. And sometimes when using React, you run into an issue to where maybe the only way to solve it or the best way to solve it is actually using some sort of DOM techniques or basic fundamental web development techniques. So before learning React, I would at least have a fundamental understanding of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Now, heading into some core concepts of React, React uses this concept of components. React lets you build user interfaces out of individual pieces called components. And then you combine these individual pieces into entire screens, pages, and applications. Don't let components scare you because they're really just JavaScript functions that return some sort of your user interface or a piece of your user interface. So in our little web page here that I used React to create, I created a component for a card that you see here that kind of does this flip around animation, and you see it render a title. And then when I hover over it, it renders some content. And you can see that I reuse this card for all of these different titles and content throughout this page. These are all the same card components that I use kind of throughout this web page. So this is a single component that I just reuse everywhere, which is a fundamental of React. You create these single components that you can then reuse throughout your entire application. So if I had other pages in my application or different sections of my application, I might want to use a card component that looks just like this one. Well, in that case, I can create a JavaScript function that just returns some piece of UI. So this card is a piece of UI, and then I can use that within my page, and then you can combine those components into an entire page or an entire application. Now, when I say return some UI, what you are going to return from these JavaScript functions, these components, are actually JSX. So this is another core concept of React. So React uses something called JSX, which it looks a lot like HTML, but it's actually just JavaScript, which it can be a little bit tricky at first, but you might come to really like combining your JavaScript and HTML all in the same file. Let's go look at what my card component actually looks like here. So this is my card function here within React.js that I used to build this website. You can see it has a title and content, and then we'll get to interactivity here in a second. But what it returns is a div, an h3, a p tag, on mouse enter, on mouse leave, and it's just a JavaScript function here. So const card is equal to an anonymous function that returns this, what looks like HTML. But this is actually, this right here is JSX, which I'll of course have their own dedicated videos on. But it looks a lot like HTML, but it's actually just JavaScript that gets converted into HTML, which allows me to use JavaScript within this JSX. And then I export this card component here and use it throughout my application. So you create these functions that return some, what looks like HTML. It ends up being HTML, so you can think of it like that for now. But it returns some JSX that gets turned into HTML. And this is a piece of your UI that you can then reuse throughout your entire application and build pages with several of these different components. And then you can compose these components together. You can pass certain components into other components, nesting components, and we'll get to all that in future videos. So JSX is a HTML-like syntax where it's actually just JavaScript that gets converted into HTML, but you get the benefit of being able to use JavaScript logic right within your HTML, which can come in really handy. Now, as I alluded to, React also has interactivity, so it provides different ways to allow the user to interact with your web page. So like what you can see I'm doing here, I'm hovering over these elements to see the content of them. You could also click a button and immediately see some sort of output on the web page. React allows good ways to manage this interactivity from the user and allow for very responsive app-like web pages and even native apps if you're using React Native. Here you can see I'm using something called useState from the React library, and then I'm just managing whether the card is flipped or it's not flipped. So if they hover on it, on mouse enter, I want to set the card to is flipped is true. But when they leave the card, I want to set is flipped to false. And then we're using this logic here within our styles, within our HTML or our JSX right here. So React gives you ways to handle different interactivity within your web pages. And I'll of course have dedicated videos on how state works and how these functions from React actually work. But it provides nice ways to handle interactivity. Now, React, it helps build user interfaces, but you can also build full stack applications in React. And it doesn't necessarily do this out of the box with just using React.js. Now you could use React as your front end and then use like Django REST framework as your back end. I've created products to where I do just that, but more common ways these days to do that is using a framework, a full stack framework in React that will allow you to do that. So that's going to be something like Next.js or a Remix Those are two common full stack frameworks that people use to build full stack applications. So both the UI, which would be front end, and then also like database work and API work, that would be more back end work. And combining the front end and the back end is considered full stack. So you can build full stack applications using React. You might just use something like a Next.js or Remix or even like Django as your backend, because React is really focused on just building what the user sees, the user interface. And kind of on that note, React is just a library. So it lets you create these components for your user interface, but it doesn't prescribe how to do routing, so how to manage different pages in React, going back and forth between pages, really linking between pages. And it also doesn't really prescribe how you should do data fetching. So if you need to get data from a certain API endpoint or your own database or whatever it might be, React doesn't really prescribe the best way to do that. However, like we just discussed, React can still be used for those full stack applications like Next.js and Remix that do provide more prescriptive ways to do data fetching and routing. Like I'm most familiar with Next.js, and I have a lot of videos on this channel about Next.js, but Next.js provides you more prescriptive ways to do routing, like Next.js has built-in routing, which I actually really like. And then it also has ways to do data fetching, and it kind of prescribes different ways to do that. Now, I'm sure Remix has very similar things, but I'm just a little bit less familiar with that full stack framework because there's only so much time in the day. Just keep in mind that React is just more so like a UI library to build user interfaces. It is less concerned about routing between pages, data fetching, doing API stuff, and all that sort of thing. But there are frameworks that build on React to do that stuff. Now, a couple of reasons why I really like React is, for one, it has a great community behind it. So React is very popular. It's used by large tech companies like Facebook, Instagram, Airbnb, Netflix, Reddit, Shopify, and I think Codecademy and several other larger companies. At least through my research, I found that these companies use it, which I know that a lot of large professional companies do use it. So you can definitely build very cool applications using it. Now, the benefit of this community isn't just like bragging rights, but it means that if you get stuck on something in React, there are a ton of resources on how to get unstuck. There's probably a blog post on the exact issue you're running into. There's a ton of different resources on how to do data fetching and routing and all that stuff if you're just using like vanilla React, so to speak. So there are a ton of resources, which, you know, if I was just starting out developing, I'd be like, who really cares? But if you're building a professional application that you're planning to maintain, having resources for that library and having a good community around a library is really important, and React definitely has that. Now, to this day, if I was going to learn a JavaScript library, I would learn React. And some reasons for that is because in the 2024 Stack Overflow survey, it puts React.js as the #1 most used framework for professional developers. And I don't even think it's really close between React. I believe it was like 39 or 46%. And Angular was the next kind of closest JavaScript library at like 19 or 20%. So React, very much so used by professional developers, which means that there's a lot of jobs for React. And in searching LinkedIn in the USA, which is where I'm located, for React.js, you see 39,000 plus open jobs there. Now, of course, not all those are going to be like entry-level jobs, and there's like running jokes that entry-level jobs these days require like 3 years of experience, but that's a whole nother topic. But what I'm saying is that when it comes to JavaScript libraries, I think React is definitely towards the top, if not the best, by a pretty decent margin in terms of job outlook. And if I was looking to get a job as soon as possible, React would be my JavaScript library of choice. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of kind of what React is, a few of the core concepts around components, JSX, and interactivity, whether you can build full stack or not, how React is just kind of a UI library, the community, job outlook, all those things. So with that kind of overview in place, if you want to continue learning React, I'm going to have several other videos within this playlist. Or maybe I already combined this into a large video and you're watching that. I have more content coming to where we're going to dive in some more specifics of React to really start learning how this technology works. So thanks for tuning into this. I'll see you in that next one.